Good evening. Welcome to Guitars and Music. Tonight we're going to review this awesome autobiography of Dr. John, Under a Hoodoo Moon. You know, I review books on this channel from time to time. I just got done reviewing Patty Boyd's. They're usually pretty good. These are interesting people, and their autobiographies are just inherently good reads. You know, if you're interested in that person and their situation, this is one of the best because of its focus on New Orleans in particular. You can't go back in time. This is Dr. John is a time capsule to a very special time in American music, and he's kind of a link to that old pre-war music. You know, he was born in 1940, so he really kind of bridges that gap between that old music that really came out of the 19th century, parlor music, saloon music, brothel music, all that music that was played before, you know, jukeboxes and the radio and recordings. It kind of takes you right back. And that kind of music was still around in the early 20th century. And he was raised he was born early enough that he kind of caught the end of that, and he was the real deal. He wasn't someone that learned piano off DVDs or after school lessons. He had some lessons, but he was a product of a time in music that's no longer here. So you hear those styles he plays today, you can hear people all over play them. They're actually pretty hard to play. Actually, New Orleans style's not easy to play, but he was an authentic version of it. Those of us that play it today, we're you know, learning a great style. But he was he was kind of the last of the Mohicans, as it were. Kind of reminds me of the time I saw Doc Watson play. I've seen him a couple times, but I got to meet him, and I heard him play several years before he died, and I realized this isn't a guy that learned flat picking sort of because he decided he liked it and he was going to college in the 1970s or something. This is a link to those old mountain flat pickers of over 100 years ago. You know, this old man sitting up there and playing this music, and he was kind of a specimen of a world that really wasn't around anymore. And that's what I think about Dr. John. It's a really interesting take. Um, so I'm going to talk about this book pretty briefly. They could read this in a college course or something. It's so interesting, particularly those early sections on New Orleans and the club scene and the nightlife, and quite frankly, the vice and the debauchery and some of the things he talks about of that period. That it's a window into a world, you know, that's for sure. And it's almost like a little sociology book in some ways. Really this is one of the best rock and roll autobiographies I think you can get. And, you know, all those Beatles, Clapton, the Stones, Keith Richards, they're all interesting. And they have that kind of post 1945 England context, you know, that's always kind of interesting to read about. But there are quite a few guys like that. They're all interesting. But this is really a rare thing. He came out of a very unique and distinct time, and it's associated with that one city, that beautiful, special, cultural, distinct city of New Orleans, which is probably one of the most culturally distinct cities in North America, in maybe, you know, where you have just such a rich tradition of cultures, and music is so integral to that, right along with the food and the beautiful architecture. There's a whole New Orleans style, and this is a great book. So welcome to Guitars and Music. I hope you'll consider subscribing. But like I said, this is a really interesting window into New Orleans. He's born in 1940. His father is an electrician. You know, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about, you know, I learned middle C, and he kind of drops a lot of this information as he goes along. And as you read it, at first it's a little confusing, but he kind of starts to bring you in. Chronology can sometimes be a little confusing. You're not always sure how old he is when he's talking about this, But as you get further into the book, you realize he was experiencing all this playing in bars and things when he was a teenager. He dropped out of high school. He was in a Catholic school, and the priest told him, you have to quit playing in those honky tonks all the time, or whatever they're called in New Orleans, clubs. And he had to choose between, playing music in all those seedy nightlife places or going to a pretty good Catholic school. And he chose music, and that was one of those choices he made as a young man, but with a lot of consequences. I imagine some people would say pros and cons, but that was the road not taken, or the road less traveled, and it made a big difference. So, but a couple interesting things. He played the piano. Now we associate him with rock and roll. I guess you would, I guess if you were going to stick him anywhere, you would stick him in classic rock. But when you think about it, that really doesn't work too well, does it? Classic rock really kind of starts with the Beatles. I guess you could even say Elvis. But the New Orleans music goes back to the 19th century, which rock does too, but New Orleans music in particular goes back to the 19th century. And when you read about this, now he started playing music in the 40s as a boy, and by the 50s was playing quite a bit. By the mid-50s, he was an active gigging musician in New Orleans. And if you think about it, that was still the age when the guitar really hadn't become what it would become. The guitar, when Elvis came out, and especially the Beatles and then Hendrix, the guitar sort of blew up. It had been around for a long time, but it became this main instrument. But for a long time, the main instrument in popular music was the piano, and there was also a lot more trombones, trumpets. Trumpet players used to be a big deal, and today I guess we associate that with big band, but you'd hear trumpet players in clubs and bars, clarinet players, and the New Orleans music he grew up in still had that kind of pre-guitar. There were guitars in it, but the guitar was kind of an accompaniment instrument, and so you really see the piano. He talks about horn players, and it's just a really diverse array of music. He mentions a lot of great pianists. He actually didn't start playing piano all the time till he was in his 20s. He was a great piano player early on, but he kind of shifted to making piano his main instrument in his early 20s. For a long time, he played guitar, and but he doesn't mention, he doesn't kind of itemize all these piano players, but he mentions like Art Tatum, Pete Johnson, and he talks about like the first song he ever learned was the Texas Boogie or the Swanee River Boogie. Of course, he met Professor Longhair, also known as Fess, when he was young, and that he was kind of one of the people that was one of his first big contacts in the music business, kind of identified his talent. James Booker, all these people are such great people, but they're very closely associated with that style of piano. Fats Domino is another one. Now Fats Domino kind of crossed over and became a kind of a national rock figure in the 50s, but he was really a New Orleans style piano player. So he goes through all that. He mentions all kinds of names. Some of them are pretty famous. I wouldn't say James Booker's, like it's not like he's John Lennon or something, but he's pretty famous. But Dr. John mentions a lot of people less famous than that. Another guy he talks a lot about that I took note of is Red Alvin Tyler. Alvin Tyler was a great saxophone player. The other interesting thing about New Orleans in that time was it was a very enclosed little community. Music was more regional back in those days anyways. There was kind of a West Coast sound. There was, in Detroit you had Motown, Chicago. And New Orleans, there was a very vibrant little New Orleans music, and they would have like New Orleans records that were big hits in the city, but, weren't that well known outside of the city. You don't really see that today much. There's a national or even international market for music. And you might have, back in those days, you might have a hit in New Orleans radio that wasn't even being played, 200 miles away. So it was a really interesting time in music, and there are a lot of things about it that I find pretty attractive. I guess it's like anything, we'd miss some things about music today, but definitely pretty interesting. He goes through all that. He started playing gigs as a young man, and that's really interesting. He mentions all these clubs. I guess if you knew the city of New Orleans, I've been there. I spent about a week there and kind of walked around the old haunts as much as I could. Really fell in love with the city. But he goes through all these old clubs. He just, all these old lounges and clubs. He names a ton of them. And one of the interesting things he says about it is that music in the 50s was very segregated. Of course, that makes sense. It was the Jim Crow era. Now, New Orleans, I've always heard had less. There definitely was a racist city with the color lines and everything, but it was also a city that, for whatever reason, you might point to the French influence or something, but there was somewhat more mixing of people in the city. I don't know, but he talks about there was pretty strict segregation in the city, but in music, in these clubs in the middle of the night, there was a lot of crossover. So you'd have black clubs and white clubs, and you'd have black bands and white bands, and black audiences, white audiences. But the city was pretty close, so after about 9 o'clock, when people had quite a few drinks, things started to mix up a little bit. And right away, he was playing with a lot of black musicians, which was actually, if you were working, was actually against the law in those days. So there was a black union for music and a white union for music. And he used to get in trouble because by the time he was a late teen, he was a band leader, and he'd be asked to put together a band for some show or something, and he said he would hire the best players, and sometimes that might mean you got a black saxophone player and a white drummer or whatever, and that was technically against the law. You were supposed to use the white players were supposed to use the white union, and black players were supposed to use the black union. Now he just kind of mentions all this fairly nonchalantly, just like any of us would, talking about memories we have from when we were a kid, but it's kind of jarring to read about when you're in such a different environment that we have today. But it's actually interesting. One of the weird things he said that kind of caught my attention about that was, in segregation, there was actually a lot more music. And actually, when they integrated in the later 60s, a lot of places didn't do as well because you had all these black clubs and all these white clubs, and then inevitably there was a lot of crossover. But that actually, I've heard that about like you hear people say that, sometimes they're older people, but people will say that about like black funeral parlors, white funeral parlors, black barbershops, white barbershops, black churches, white churches. And there were in a city like New Orleans with such an emphasis on music and nightlife, there were all these black clubs and white clubs. And actually that meant that there was a ton of music in the city. We're not saying that was a good thing, but it's an interesting observation. There was a ton of music, and it was great music. You'd go hear literally some of the best players in the world, all within a couple square miles. And of course, as you see in a lot of the southern cities, really, there might have been a lot of segregation, but people live, geographically speaking, pretty close together. So again, in New Orleans, you'd have black clubs, white clubs, and they might be a block apart or something. So that's a great mixture of culture that you get there, and that's why that city is so important. But he talks so much about playing. It's just really interesting to read. He said that they would start playing in the morning. He would play hours and hours a day, like 3-4 gigs a day. Sometimes they'd have a morning but a lunch gig, and that would be kind of casual. And then as the day went on, they kept just moving to all these other places. And, by the evening, they'd be playing in places where people were drinking. And then he said a lot of times they'd play in places starting at 3 or 4 in the morning. And that was really raunchy. He mentioned some names of songs they used to do. And I'm not even going to say the names, but I'm sure there were humorous songs, but they're definitely some X-rated lyrics. And a lot of these places were that you would play late at night were strip clubs and hookers which is my next point, which is about what a decadent, vice-filled world that was back in those days. What a city of sin. Oh my gosh, he goes through all that in a rather nonplussed way, but it's striking. But he said that one rule that they had was when a fight broke out, as it often did, the band was supposed to not stop. They were supposed to play louder and faster. And that actually happened to me once when I was a kid. We were playing in a kind of a tough biker bar, and a fight broke out. And we, believe it or not, it sounds too good to be true, we were playing Born to Be Wild. And that was a long time ago, but I still remember up there playing Born to Be Wild and hitting those bow, bow. And these two big guys out there on the dance floor fighting. It was, don't want to condone it, but it was it was something you won't forget. Let's put it that way. But he goes through all that. It's really, really interesting. And he almost just overlooks the fact that he was playing with all these great people. You know, he's kind of walking through all the drama, how they got the jobs. We played here, we played there. And what's almost just assumed, like, oh, well, it's no big deal. I was playing with, this sax player that's great, and this drummer that's one of the great drummers of the 20th century. He's dropping all these names. And a lot of them were kind of New Orleans people, but New Orleans had some great musicians in it, which it still does today. I walked down through New Orleans, and it's one of the places where you can go. You'll be walking down the street, and there'll be like an awesome clarinet player playing with the piano out on the street in front of a bar, with not in a tuxedo and evening gown concert, though, sitting out in front of a bar. You'll hear a clarinet. Now, when's the last time you heard a clarinet playing in a bar? But he'll be talking about this, just playing away, and he's just dropping all these names, and you realize it's like we never know what we have till it's gone. He's describing a really great musical scene, is what he's describing. There is a context, and I don't know if there was a golden age, but what he's describing was a pretty awesome city and a lot of awesome music. But the other thing that this book has in it is a lot of vice. Now, I don't even know how much I should share, but Dr. John was not, he was the adult dose. Now, when you read this, you realize these musicians were street hustlers. And it reminds me of old Shakespeare class when we learned about how people used to look down on actors and musicians, which I still sometimes think people do. Try to imagine a musician being appointed to the Supreme Court. Can you imagine what everybody would do? I think a lot of them would do a hell of a lot better than the people on there now, if you'll forgive me. But anyway, people would always look down on musicians. Well, actually, and actors. But the context is a lot of these people were kind of hustling all the time, so that the world that they inhabited often had a lot of vice and kind of petty crimes, not necessarily big, horrible crimes, but a lot of kind of petty crimes and criminality associated with it. And when you read about Dr. John, he was a hustler. It's kind of shocking to realize this is probably, by the end of his life, he'd become one of the most famous musicians in the country. That wasn't always the case, I would say. He used to be, he had that one hit, Right Place, Wrong Time. He was in The Last Waltz. I think a lot of people that like good music knew who he was. But he's one of those people that sort of became more and more famous as he got older. But he was a hustler in those early days, and I was kind of shocked at some of the... this guy... Hard drugs, no problem, like he was 13 or 14, doing hard drugs. Like one of them starts with an H, and he ended up doing that for a lot of his life, but he describes it in a fairly nonchalant way. He said the good stuff everybody wanted gave you a ginger taste on your tongue, and it came on slow, and that was the good stuff. But he talks about all this crime. He was a pimp. They'd be playing in strip clubs, and so there was inevitably a lot of prostitution. A lot of the girls he had hung around with were hookers, and then he became a pimp. he was a forger. He forged a lot of prescriptions for drugs. They used to rob pharmacies. They would pickpocket. The other crime that he mentions doing that I found sad, really, but we used to procure abortions for people. He said he met some guy that was from Eastern Europe that used to do abortions in Nazi Europe. I guess illegal abortions, but he used to do abortions somehow or another in Nazi Europe, and the guy ended up in New Orleans. So Dr. John it was sort of almost like part of his job as a pimp. He would know this guy, and he would take, for a price, he would take girls to see this guy to get an abortion, and of course he'd get paid, for sort of arranging it. And the other thing he said is after it was over, his job it was to dispose of the fetus. So Dr. John, one of the great piano players in the world, as far as I'm concerned, when he was young, he used to drive around in the middle of the night after these back alley abortions and find a place to throw a dead baby. The other thing is he had some colorful characters in there. Listen to I wrote down some of the nicknames of some of these people. You'll have to forgive me. Some of these I wouldn't say. I'm assuming most people aren't watching this. I definitely wouldn't say this in some company. But here's some of just a small sampling of the nicknames of his friends in those days in New Orleans. Opium Rose, okay? We all got a friend named Opium Rose. Big Boob Betty. Big Dick Jim. WAP. How'd you like? Hey, WAP. I don't even want to laugh, but it was just, that's what everybody called the guy, WAP. Ching Chong. Stale Bread Charlie. One of his very best friends was a heroin addict named Skank. How'd you like to be called Skank? And in prison, Dr. John went to prison. He was arrested for heroin, and he went to prison, and one of his best friends in there was named Cheeky. And how'd you like to be in prison? And there was a reason he was named Cheeky. He was in prison, apparently a very popular young guy, and he was nicknamed Cheeky. So, and that's just a sampling of the nicknames in here. So this is just, it's just a underground world of, and it's weird. These people are all great musicians. I think it was very different back then. These would be like great musicians, and they'd be out there fencing stolen goods or running pimp operations, and in between gigs, some of the great musicians in the country. It's kind of hard to imagine today in a way, but and I think that was part of this hustle world and music was, we don't always talk about it. Music was very associated with vice and kind of petty criminality. I don't think major criminality, but all that stuff is kind of what you might call vice. And the other thing he talks about, he was finally arrested, and he talks about how the police started to do sting operations. The police started to lie. Police never used to be able to lie to you. But they started to, the undercover things were rare, at least before the 60s or so, and that changed the city a lot. I think there was a kind of easygoing attitude, relatively speaking, to a lot of that in the 40s and 50s, and in the 60s they really started to crack down, which is kind of interesting. He talks about Jim Garrison, who was a pretty prominent politician in the 60s, ended up doing a lot of the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And boy, he doesn't like Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison had a big vice squad and really tried to crack down on all that vice in the city of New Orleans, which of course it hurts music. I've often thought it's kind of like the war on drugs. It hurts music. I hate to say that, but it does, because the music's part of that world, and it's like taking cocktails out of Frank Sinatra. It's not the same, and so, but he then ends up, he goes to prison for a couple years, and then when he left, he went out to L.A., and that was kind of the beginning of his move into more mainstream, non-New Orleans music. That's actually kind of when he adopted this Voodoo persona. Now, he was raised around a lot of voodoo. I mean, he was raised around spells and charms. he talks about all that. But he sort of adopted it as a motif for his stage persona in the late 60s when he started becoming more national. And he did that album Gree, which became a pretty popular album. And he was also associated with the Wrecking Crew. And, by the 70s, he was a pretty famous piano player. The final thing I wanted to say is he spent a lot of the 80s. He always kind of reminds me of Johnny Winter, playing all the time, but also a drug addict. So he never quit playing. That drugs and music, he didn't seem to have a conflict between those two things for him, unfortunately or unfortunately. But it did kind of, he just didn't do as much on the scene. That always reminds me of Johnny Winter. If you look at Johnny Winter, he never stopped playing. But he was a drug addict all those years. And, you just see him around playing in kind of comfortable, low-pressure situations, and that always kind of reminds me of Dr. John, probably doing drugs and playing and finding places that was a comfortable arrangement. But so this is a really good book. The later sections, you start to have all the names and the famous people, but the best sections are those sections on New Orleans. What a rich, interesting book. Wouldn't want to approve of all the things he talks about in here, but boy, oh boy, it was whatever else you say about it, it just reminds you of where a lot of that rock and roll music and blues and jazz, it comes out of saloons and frankly brothels, strip clubs. We say that all the time. It's sort of almost an afterthought because today we almost try to divorce it from those things in some ways. But that's where it came from. And when you read this book, you're reminded of the reality of the origins of a lot of that great music. It came from the nightlife and vice in that world. And for all its problems, it was a world that, people had a lot of fun in. And the music was part of that. And it was a world before a lot of jukeboxes. So they had all that live music, and they didn't have big sound systems necessarily in all these bars. So there was live music in every one of these places. So I've done a couple book reviews on here. This is one of the best books. I'd recommend this in a college course or something for the right type of situation. It's a great book. Really is. I think it's probably the best rock autobiography I've ever read in terms of really having a distinct, interesting world that it sheds light on. Dr. John is not only a great piano player, he is a primary source, as we would say, for a world that's not around anymore. Still great music in New Orleans, by the way, and I'm sure there's still some vice in the city too, but he is really a time capsule. When he remembers stuff, it's worth reading. And he was only in his 50s when he wrote this, and I thought, well, that's really fine because what people are going to remember about this book is that New Orleans, that's like living through something that's really special, almost like someone who lives through a major political event or a war or something, or lives in a really interesting time. He was born in a really interesting time and place, and it's worth reading about. I 110% recommend this book. Dr. John, Under a Hoodoo Moon. God bless you. Good night.